This was recorded at 9 p.m. Wednesday night, the 23rd of February. It was 8 hours after we stopped recording at 5 a.m. the next day, so Thursday morning, the 24th of February, that Russia decided to finally invade the Ukraine. I just wanted to timestamp when we actually recorded this to allow for the appropriate context as you're listening. The podcast is with Jim Henry, who is a godfather to the field of investigative journalism for financial secrecy, offshore finance, capital flight, kleptocracy. He published Blood Bankers back in 2003, which exposed hundreds of corrupt kleptocratic infrastructure projects across the developing world, which we covered more fully in episode 49 of the podcast. I wanted to ask Jim about the efficacy of sanctions generally, and then specifically the sanctions being thrown against Russia in this moment that is happening with the Ukraine. So in the podcast, you will hear Jim speak about Russia's current economic issues, Putin's domestic problems, a consideration of sanctions, and then as well, general closing thoughts where we dread the surreal prospect of what has since become the reality, a potential war in Europe. And so with no further ado, here is Jim Henry. Well, Mr. Henry, Jim, welcome back to the podcast, mate.
Good to be with you.
So we were talking yesterday. I responded to your email newsletter. You were speaking a lot about the Citibank leak last week, but now obviously there's a lot of...
actually.
Of course, sorry. And now there's a lot of chat about the capital flight out of Russia, the sanctions, how effective they are, and all of that. So I really wanted to hear what you thought about it. But to start us off, right now it's Wednesday the 22nd. What is the situation as it stands now?
Well, I think we've gone from wondering whether Putin was going to invade to deciding how much of Ukraine he actually wants to occupy. And so the good news is that the world community seems so far to be standing up to him. And even China has expressed doubts about, whether we should be messing around with the territorial integrity of countries like the Ukraine for its own reasons. But Putin has definitely burned his bridges, I think, this time around. And from my standpoint, the sanctions so far appear to be commanding a lot of unanimity within the EU and the United States and NATO. And so that's a positive thing. Whether these sanctions that they've already implemented are really going to make much difference to Putin is doubtful, because I think he's already discounted them. And there's another whole level of sanctions that we might be able to implement here that would maybe cause them to have second thoughts, and more importantly, have an impact on the Russian elites who are going to be in the background here. Because he has a domestic political problem in addition to his international problems. I think that may actually be one of the reasons he did this, because over time, the Russian economy has not been performing very well. It's had, it's failed to diversify, heavily dependent on commodities like energy, and so in a way, I think this is a guy who's been in power for quite a while. People are beginning to wonder: is this all there is kind of animosity toward the West? He doesn't have a whole lot of allies that you want to take to a dinner party. People like Assad and Maduro in Venezuela. He's got the Wagner Group working out all over Africa, in countries like Mali, and he's in Libya, and he's I don't know what his game plan is. He seems to be making it up as he goes along, but in this case, I would argue that he's made a mistake the size of his life. And this is really going to be hard to undo.
You mentioned he's got a big domestic problem. What specifically are you talking about there?
Well, the Navalny opposition, I mean, he's thrown this fellow in jail. He's not really dealt with the broader. He's increasing over the last year, we've seen it. And I was involved with Amnesty in this episode last January 2021, where we were involved with trying to get Amnesty a prisoner of conscience status. Amnesty had the embarrassing kind of reversal there, where they declared him not to be a prisoner of conscience, and then they went ahead and gave it back to him. But there's no question that you know both in Russia and in his satellites like the Belarus, the last year have become sort of seen a period of opposition growing. That's been an important consideration here that I think we need to take into account. He spent a lot of time preparing for this, and so it's sort of something you would have expected to have prepared more carefully for some of the sanctions. I mean, the Russian reserves that have been accumulated are north of $600 billion. But one of the mere great impacts that we've seen so far is something that I don't think he's paying enough attention to, and that is the tremendous dependence that Russia has on foreign capital markets. And Russian oligarchs in particular, the top 2,000 people in the country, have more than, by now, probably more than $2 trillion offshore invested in private capital flight that has.
What's that? That's larger than the entire domestic Russian economy, right?
Yeah, the Russian economy is about $2 trillion, sort of depending on whose estimates you use. But the important thing is to see that Russia's access to foreign investment is dried up. I mean, the Moscow Stock Exchange this week has plummeted 10%. It's only about $250 billion stock market to begin with, so it's not one of the world beaters. But insofar as these moves by Russia make it harder for Russia to attract foreign capital, and indeed make it more difficult for it to keep money at home, I think that's another vulnerability we haven't heard much about. I've been recently studying the case of Credit Suisse, and the OCCRP and other journalists have put together a tremendous expose in the last week on the role of this big number 2 largest Swiss bank in basically spending decades building a network of kleptocrats and money laundering facilities for some of the worst dictators in the world. I would be very surprised if there were no Russians as clients at that bank. So, that's kind of illustrative of the sort of problem we're dealing with. There are an awful lot of Western institutions that have profited from these flight flows. But it's kind of timely that we came up with this massive report and revelations from this whistleblower just this weekend. I think what we're seeing here is really it's kind of calling the question of how we got into this mess, and it highlights the role that U.S. policy in the 1990s played, in which we basically gave into a model of kleptocracy, in which basically the Russian oligarchs took command of a great deal of the state enterprise that Russia had accumulated. And Putin was kind of a reaction to all that. Russia went through effectively a Great Depression in the 1990s. Rather than have a Marshall Plan for Russia, both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration decided against giving any kind of aid to Russia and let them sort of find financial relief for themselves. And so that drove them to a policy of doing things like massive privatizations, the so-called loans for shares program, basically ended up enriching a comparative handful of Russian oligarchs. And when U.S. officials like Larry Summers, Assistant Secretary of Treasury in 1996 at Davos, was confronted by Jeffrey Sachs with this, Sachs said to Summers, all these folks that you're enlisting in these loans for shares programs are crooks, they're criminals. And Summers' response was, do you have any proof? So, we had a conversation with Richard Clark, who's senior national security advisor in the U.S. government throughout this period. And he said, oh, it was a tremendous victory for U.S. foreign policy that we got all this money to come out of Russia. So, like, there was something we should celebrate. Well, I think that's absolutely upside down. I mean, what it did was essentially to undermine Russian democracy. It empowered oligarchs who were willing to have someone like Putin that they could cut deals with. And then the money flowed abroad, where it's ended up doing things like financing Donald Trump in his campaigns. It was a tremendous amount of foreign Soviet Union money that came out of places like Kazakhstan and Russian oligarchs. So, in the long run, this policy of encouraging kleptocracy in Russia, or at least permitting it, turning a blind eye to it, I think undermined Russian democracy, and it created the demand for Putin. And we're dealing with the consequences of that.
Talk about the sanctions as specifically as you can, what they've already been, and then what the sort of threat might be further down.
Well, so far the sanctions that have been agreed to by the EU and the United States and the UK focus on kind of three basic measures. One is there are some energy projects, Nord Stream 2 pipeline project, which is already paid for and built, but has yet to be licensed, produces Russia provides about 40% of Europe's gas right now, and this would be adding to it. So it's a pipeline that Russia had been looking forward to selling more gas to Germany. And I think the Ukraine was going to see some of the gas demand that had been channeled to it and drained away by Russia. That's been tabled now, and it's not going to be opening anytime soon. But that's in the scheme of things, a relatively small hit, and I'm sure Putin was anticipating that. Secondly, they've sanctioned some more public officials and some banks. Two big Russian banks. The VEB is one of the best-known Russian banks that's been sanctioned, so they're going to have a hard time having access to Western capital markets. They have put a embargo on Russian sovereign debt being traded on Western capital markets. It's not clear whether that's just applying to new issues or to all secondary markets. They have also been talking about the further sanctions, but not implementing them, that they might implement if Russia goes, full tanto, as the UK defense minister said today. Tanto is not a reference to the 1950s TV network station. In Spanish, it means fool. And so, a lot of people are looking at these sanctions that have been implemented so far as stage one. It's kind of a response to his sending troops into these breakaway republics in the eastern Ukraine. But if he goes beyond that and sends troops over the border into the outside of the republics, they're talking about sanctions like cutting Russia off from the SWIFT bank clearing networks, which would really have a dramatic effect on international trade with Russia. And then I've been thinking about this notion that the $2 trillion of Russian capital flight wealth that's sitting offshore, it may be time for that to be, sort of either we could go either way. We could sort of welcome more of it, but we don't know how much more there is in Russia to be taken out. Stock market this week fell by 11% on the day that Putin announced this move into the Ukraine. In Moscow, the stock market is only about a $250 billion exchange, so it's not huge, but that is indicative of investors taking their money to the sidelines, and in some cases, any Russian investors might be thinking actively about moving more funds offshore, given the way this may play out. But the EU collectively is a much larger economy, maybe 10 times the size of Russia. So it's sort of it's been an attractive place for Russians to invest. But we might well decide to go after some of this Russian flight capital. It's been very easy to be a wealthy oligarch in Russia, to have become essentially a citizen of nowhere for tax purposes. So you can have the best of all worlds. You have a great relationship with the dictator back home, and you've got your Russian enterprises that you've acquired, often through, not necessarily through your own industry, but through clever chicanery since the 1990s. And then you're allowed to have golden passports to travel around Europe, to have Cyprus and Malta were the most notorious for offering these to Russians, but to get into
there's cases of people buying diplomatic status and stuff.
Diplomatic status, I've seen that a lot in the case of other countries, but it's also been a factor here. And so they end up, buying sports teams in Monaco, and enjoying life on, they call London Moscow on the Thames. The oligarchs have had free reign. The Tory party had this strange relationship with this guy who financed Brexit, named Aaron Banks, who could never quite account for whether his money was Russian. There's major Russian investors who come to the United States and park money in real estate and other kinds of assets here. So it's been a little bit too easy on this oligarchy, this Gark class, to have the best of both worlds, dictatorship and free markets, and they kind of rely on the fact that we have laws and institutions and independent courts that actually protect investors. So should they continue to enjoy that tax-free? Many of these folks don't pay taxes anywhere.
So you're suggesting that this would be a sort of more extreme level of sanction, but isn't the problem at the heart of all of Russia's capital flight that it's unlegislatable, it's unregulatable, it exists outside of whatever you could potentially sanction? How would you actually end up curtailing that?
Well, I think, you go at it the other way around. In the UK, they have laws about suspicious assets that have no known origins. And so it's enough already to say, okay, there's a hell of a lot of capital here, we just don't know where it came from. Please explain. And until you explain, we're going to freeze it. We're going to freeze the bank account. So we really don't have to necessarily identify. We can have some pretty good idea that it's coming out of Russia. I think that it would be possible to narrow this down, so we're not hitting a lot of folks from other countries. But that's kind of an investigative question, and there's no question that if we opened up the sanctions to a lot more people of Russian citizenship and made it harder for them to travel, and identified some of the folks, there's a good list to begin with the people who have the golden passports in places like Cyprus, that we could make it harder for them to play this double game. And I guess the ask would be, look, you want to enjoy Western democratic institutions and freedom and the rule of law, go back to Russia and fix it. Make it happen. I mean, you have influence. Short of that, we could say, I think, that we're going to take a much closer look at where those funds have come from and do some more investigations.
So the idea is that you hurt the oligarchs, that would then compound on this domestic pressure that Putin might already be feeling, and that could be a way to then incentivize his behavior. Yes,
and I think that there's some interesting divisions to be made, distinctions to be made. There are people who would be willing to be quite active in their opposition to Putin and should be welcomed, wherever they invest. And there are folks who are really known cronies and are very close to the regime. And in that category, we have quite a few candidates who are yet to be sanctioned and yet to be on the list. And we have institutions like Credit Suisse and Deutsche Bank that are kind of notorious havens for Russian money. I think it's time to ask them to take a closer look at transactions from that region.
Where does Russia's lousy economic situation fit into all of this? So they are sort of comparable to what Spain, I believe, in terms of GDP. You said the stock market's worth 250 billion. How much of the motivating factor for what he's doing now is explicable by a just dying economy and failing demographics and a rather bleak picture for the future of Russia?
Well, there's no question that since he's been empowered there, he has not focused on developing an economic strategy for the country. I think China is kind of a good contrast. We've seen lots of companies investing in China and wanting access just because it's a huge market, but also because it has a different attitude towards technology and toward receptivity of Western science and modern technology. So Russia, it's fair to say, doesn't have, sort of heavily dependent to this day on commodities and, gold, platinum, oil and gas.
Just oil and gas, right? Yeah.
Basic oil and gas is the major one, but in terms of exports, and I think that the Russian per capita income about $25,000 a year. It sort of hasn't been growing very much. It shows that, and it's remarkable to me that if you went back to the 1980s, the one area that Russia had some claim to was in basic science and sort of outstanding technology, but partly because of the 1990s, it basically deindustrialized. So if Putin had pursued a strategy that was focusing on attracting investment, on attracting technology, and making the economy more competitive, and making it more equal in terms of opportunities, emphasizing making, for example, the universities really first world kind of quality, I think you would have had a much more democratic outcome here in the long time. It's not as if it wouldn't have had problems, but Russia per se has always had a lot of human capital and sort of prided itself on education and culture. That's going to suffer under this current strategy, which is very antagonistic. I mean, what artists are going to want to visit Moscow and perform, or Leningrad? I mean,
145 million people. It's huge.
Yeah, and it's aging. The population is, sort of.
They got some of the worst demographics in Europe.
Yeah, and I think they've suffered greatly under the COVID thing. The United States is no one to brag, but I think Russia's had and probably the official body counts are much higher than the ones they've shown. But that's not a success story for Russian medicine, and. So, in short...
What, you mean Sputnik wasn't a miracle of science?
Well, Sputnik maybe, but no, I think, they were producing the Sputnik vaccine you're talking about.
Yeah.
That has apparently failed in, several trials. Although I'm in favor of vaccines. I just want to make that clear. So, but even the Russian version. No, I think the issue here is there is an asymmetry in this relationship they have with the West in basic finance, and they receive very little foreign investment at this time, and they're very dependent. They're actually to the point of where they're a very large creditor to the EU and the US, effectively, after you take into account their foreign debts and their reserves and all of this flight capital sitting offshore. They're basically net lenders to the rest of us. So what does the world do when it doesn't like a creditor? It basically defaults. So if we really wanted to get serious on pressuring the Russian elite, as opposed to Putin in particular, we would broaden these sanctions to a much wider audience of oligarchs who are enjoying the privilege of having it, the secrecy and the anonymity and the kind of legal protections afforded by places like Switzerland.
That would be great precedence, right? I thought from conversations we've had in the past, and obviously blood bankers, kind of at the core of the whole problem of capital flight and kleptocracy and offshore financial secrecy is the inability to do anything about it. It would be a surprise to me if all of a sudden we could do something about it simply as a, I don't know, what would you call
I don't think that this is a blunt
to hurt Russia.
Yeah, but this is a blunt instrument, and in general, we have a problem with this outline of the blood bankers about the fact that the developing countries, far from being net recipients of capital from the West, are net creditors of the OECD and wealthy countries, and kleptocrats find it far too easy to exploit secrecy and private banking to hide their stolen assets offshore. And that's the general case of this. How do you address that problem once it's happened? Well, you work on both sides. One, I've argued, is that Russia would, should definitely try to do more to attract foreign capital. This is almost the exact opposite of what you would do to attract foreign capital. But the other side of it is that if it's here, make it, at least tax it, make it harder, make it pay for some of the operations that Putin is having, and make it pay part of the bill for this, because right now a lot of that is tax-free.
Here's something that is being discussed quite a lot now. This is all happening. There's, I think, quite a lot of criticism of particularly Joe Biden, but also sort of EU leaders as well, that simple sanctions aren't necessarily effective at curtailing behavior. So how effective are sanctions at curtailing bad behavior, especially when it seems the motivation in this particular case with Russia and Ukraine, they might be willing to take the short-term loss because they consider whatever the cultural unification of Ukraine is as an ultimate long-term gain. How effective are sanctions, basically?
Yeah, if you're going to do the business case for sanctions here, I would cite the case of South Africa as a case in which South African apartheid is a success story in the mid-'80s. Mainly bank sanctions were the most effective there. South Africa had a hard time doing trade finance. And I think that it helped to make the South African white elite at that point conscious of the fact that if they are ever going to survive and make the country grow again, they were going to have to get back in touch with human rights and get rid of apartheid. And that led to radical transformation in a system that many people thought was impossible to change at that point. I was there several times and saw it. And there was just a mood of, we can do nothing. There's no pressure points that South Africa hasn't thought of. Well, they hadn't anticipated that the biggest banks in the world had basically said no to apartheid lending. So that's an example in the plus side. There are many examples where sanctions have been imperfectly implemented, and there have been, leaks with regimes, and Saddam Hussein is a great example of that. But we can go on. I share the sort of concern that unless we have a unified front against Putin, like we had in South Africa, unless we have a raise the ante and make this financial sanctions, and in South Africa's case, that could be that consisted of cutting off access to loans. In the case of Russia, they're not borrowing heavily abroad, so that's, you're left to this area of capital flight. Um, but in principle, I mean, the sanctions that they've already implemented will take time to work. They will have, if they go to the next level, it'll take a whack out of Russia's GDP growth, no question about that. But it may take several years to actually have a full effect. I don't see why the business case. I mean, if Putin obviously didn't have to produce a business case for this before any kind of democratic council. He basically called the shots. It's hard to imagine that this pays for itself to Russia. I mean, taking those republics, the cost to Russia's reputation, Putin's reputation. It's going to be hard to get anyone to believe and trust in Russia as a place to do business with. So, what are the economic payoffs for the Russian invasion? It's going to be, I think, a big loser, and it's going to get worse if the sanctions hold together. What Putin is counting on is that there are many European countries where Russia has had extraordinary influence and has people on the ground who are basically, I wouldn't say necessarily they're on the take, but well, why not? Let's say they're on the take. There are senior politicians, at least, who have had, are known to have had long-standing relationships in Germany, in Austria, certainly in
the United Kingdom,
in the UK and France, and so I think what he's counting on here, has been is that there will be division in the ranks, and this will divide the EU, and especially if we go to the next level of sanctions, which is, the SWIFT network issue might be one aspect of that. There will be, sort of more opposition, but if we don't see that, and if we have the EU standing together and NATO standing together on this issue, I think we may have a better prospect. I don't know exactly how this will walk back, but you can imagine, the U.S. has said it's open to diplomacy and will remain so, just not this week.
It feels like an all-in move from Russia, and there is an element of it being hysterical. It feels a little bit unhinged. There is no sort of rational explanation that us non-Russians, non-Ukrainians can really understand. I was speaking to my mate about it who was Russian, and she was all on board, right? Because she's deeply nationalistic and identifies with this notion that the Ukraine is Russia. But it just feels like on an international geopolitical stage, this is an unhinged move. And that kind of adds an element of fear to it, because there's a very real reality that a couple thousand kilometers from me, there might be an invasion.
The Russian ambassador to Sweden was saying, was warning Sweden against joining NATO. Sweden is one of the countries in Europe that's, traditionally not been a member of NATO, and
yeah, they
Finland
play both
is
hands.
also. They play both hands, but I'm told by my Finnish colleagues that sentiment in terms of joining NATO is rising, and indeed, before this happened, the sentiment in the Ukraine toward joining NATO was about 50-50. Now it's more like 60-40. I'm interested in Russian popular opinion about this. We haven't seen people in the streets, sort of saluting and, giving Putin a great, sort of round of applause for this. I think it's rather quiet. But it's hard to get information on polls in Russia that, so we just don't, we don't know. It would be, in fact, a great thing to do is to try to call up, 25 Russians at random and say, how do you feel about this? I think at the end of the day, you'd say, let's go invade another country. Oh, okay, Ukraine. That Ukraine is a country with an economy that's performing even less well than Russia. I mean, taking it on and being responsible for it. So maybe Putin is counting on producing lots of refugees that will drive the Europeans crazy. I agree with you that there's something pathological about this, and as you heard Putin speak the other day, you were saying, well, this man needs a therapist. I mean, he really. Yes, it is true. Thank you very much for the contributions of the Soviet Union to defeating the Nazis. If we haven't said that all enough, we would love to take you out to lunch and say it again.
A pat on the back.
There was this little episode in 1939 where Stalin signed a pact with Hitler, which kind of enabled him to invade, Western Europe. But let's put that aside, and we'll stipulate that many millions of Russians died in World War II, and we are grateful for that. And seriously, I mean, the West does not do enough to celebrate to pay tribute to the sacrifices that Russia made, which essentially, I would say, most objective historians say that by 1942, the German invasion had been curtailed and Hitler had been defeated. So, yes, thank you. And I think that's a sore spot. This issue of the history of the Ukraine. I mean, if you go back to the 7th century, the Norwegians had occupied, Kiev. I mean, when there were just plantains and empty forests in Moscow, Kiev had a very dynamic civilization. It was thanks to my Viking ancestors. I mean, they were the ones who, for 4 centuries, had built. So, Putin, we want you out. The Norwegians are coming. This notion that we can rewrite history and start.
He said Ukraine was made by Lenin.
Yeah, there was like this notion that this is the weirdest thing I've heard. I've sort of, it's called barking. Barking mad, I think, is the British phrase. The idea that so I think that at the end of the day, we have to get him back. He's clearly calling a lot of the shots, and he may not be well.
Well, look, we said we'd keep it a short snapshot, so I just want to finish with this one. You lived through the Cold War. Russia is the old enemy, right, to many people in the United States. What do you make of all the war rhetoric, and how likely is an invasion on non-Russian separatist territory, a legitimate invasion of a European country, and potentially a European war?
I mean, I don't think I can sit here, in the United States and really comment on the objectively the realities on the ground there very clearly. It seems to me from a slight distance that we have an enormous risk of accidents of Russia, even if they have no intention of invading the rest of the Ukraine. There was a big cyber attack today on banks in Ukraine. Putin is giving us no reason not to believe that he is bound on invading and taking out the rest of the country.
All signs
the deployments that he's made, all signs are pointed in that direction. I can't imagine him saying, "Oh, sorry, just an exercise." Back to judo. I just don't see it happening. It's not in the cards. I do think Russia and the United States have a tortured history. We've actually had many periods of cooperation and good relations with the Russian people. And most Americans, when they are aware of all the relationships that the United States has had with Russia, are delighted to go back to that. There's no fundamental animosity at all. The problem is this guy and his inner circle. It's kind of. He likes to claim that the Ukrainians are Nazis, but if you read best biographies of Adolf Hitler, during the period of the Sudetenland crisis in Czechoslovakia and the ramp up of troops on the Czech border during that period, 1938. And the kind of the weak Western response to it. You're just struck by the degree to which one guy can basically cause all of this damage to international relations if he just is able to have the power to do so domestically, and that's what we have with Putin right now. This is a good example, if we needed another one, of the perils of dictatorship. That's why capital flight has soared out of Russia and will continue to do so until there's a change in that basic story. I'm sorry to say that, but we would like to see Russia back. In the 1990s, I went to. First trip to Russia was in 1985, before the fall of the wall, and I went to Leningrad at that point. I enjoyed it immensely. The Russian people are phenomenal and warm, and so you could see. But it also struck me that the country was basically, surprisingly underdeveloped. In 1996, I went back and we wrote a piece for the New Republic about how Russia was being mistreated by the West, and that basically we were dealing with all these kleptocrats, and we were basically enabling Boris Yeltsin at that point, who, the guy who was found at 4 a.m. in the streets of outside the White House in his underwear, drunk as a skunk one night.
Yeah, what a famous
This
boozer.
guy was empowered,
Yeah.
And Marshall Pomer and I wrote this piece about after the 1998 Russian crash, about how we basically screwed up our relations with the Russian people and failed to have a democratic transition because we enabled these kleptocrats. Well, Putin was the consequence of that. So there's no question that the United States and its partners in NATO have a lot of responsibility for what's happening right now. It goes way back. It doesn't excuse it.
Of course not.
Nobody's trying to excuse it. I think that there is a camp within the United States that is kind of, I would call them Putin apologists here, and saying, why aren't we, it's all our fault. I think it's hard to explain Putin's behavior in terms of just a response to NATO, or just feeling threatened by NATO. I mean, he can look at Estonia and Poland and feel threatened, but they're not going anywhere. No, it's basically a land grab, and it has to stop.
All right. On the subject of Russia's lousy economy, sanctions or capital flight, is there anything left that you want to say on this moment?
This is a really artificial crisis, and it would be, the world has so many serious problems to get on with. I mean, Putin has a big contribution to make. Russia certainly does, to solving the climate crisis. We can't wait, to do that. We still have a pandemic raging. We hope that we're through with that, but that's a problem for the public health services.
Is it really a non-issue, Jim? I mean, there's potentially going to be a country invaded. That seems like a giant thing.
No, I'm not saying it's not an issue. I'm saying it's an artificial issue. It's a serious.
Right, yeah.
It's
completely avoidable.
Completely gratuitous, voluntary, poking yourself in the eye with a sharp stick.
This is the thing.
Low upside for everybody. I
yeah.
said this, the last 2 weeks ago. I said, I cannot believe, at the end of the day, I mean, a lot of people are forecasting invasion. Rationally speaking, it just makes no sense for Russia. It's no sense for us. It's lose-lose. And so we have so much to do together. We're not enemies. It makes no sense to be enemies. So
I hope that NATO fast track Ukraine into the organization.
Well,
and just force Putin's hand.
Yeah, at this point, it looks like that might be.
And bring them into the EU as well. It's such a good country, isn't it? Ukraine is one of the.
You
It
know,
has some
I
of the
have a
highest
different
potential.
proposal. I have a different proposal. I would like to bring Russia into into NATO, um, and see if they could. One of the conditions would, of course, be democratic systems
Yeah, but I don't
and the
think they
rule of
want to be.
law. But it would get rid of this kind of artificial nonsense and no excuse. I mean, let's
Yeah.
bring them in and try to at least have serious affiliation, so that the paranoia, which is evident here, uh, is eliminated.
Hmm. All right, mate. Well, correction. It's Wednesday, the 23rd of February, 9 p.m. European time. It's important to timestamp this because obviously it could all change overnight tomorrow, and
Right.
it seems hot to boil at the moment. So, shit. Yeah, it's.
Good luck with it. Good luck with
Yeah,
being in Sweden.
I was saying
On
to
the
my
front.
mate today at the gym, who he served 3 tours in Afghanistan with Swedish military, and we were talking about this. We were talking about Russia, Ukraine, and I made the comment that it's so surreal that there could legitimately be a country invading another country for pretty much no reason. Because for me, in my generation, as an Australian as well, you read a lot about wars, you watch war documentaries, you know what happens. But in my lifetime, it's never happened. Because there's all this rhetoric of that we're beyond that. This thing can't happen anymore for X, Y, and Z reasons. But it's really weird that it could happen. And so,
Well, I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm old enough to have remembered that as a reality. In 1961, I was 11 years old, and we were all terrified. It was October 1961, and Khrushchev and Kennedy were going back and forth. And at a certain point, the U.S. military advised Kennedy to launch a bombing raid on these missile sites that they'd identified in Cuba. What they did not know, and which McNamara later so admitted, was that they already had acquired nuclear weapons in Cuba. That there were several short-term, medium-term nuclear weapons in Cuba. So if they had launched that airstrike, we would have had Miami at least go up in smoke. So that shows how perilous these things are, because these folks think they know what they're doing and they make mistakes. So that's what worries me the most here, is that someone will make a mistake and this will accelerate beyond our wildest dreams. But I agree with you that it's unprecedented and it is surreal. That is the right word for it. And it's eminently avoidable. If I were able to talk to Putin, I would just
you
try
talk
to
him
find
off the
some-
ledge, Jim.
I would try to talk him off the ledge. I mean, come on, Vlad, for God's sake. No, but he's not a nice guy. He's
No,
I've
but
seen
he's
his
a
handiwork,
no.
and he's not a guy.
He's got a very, very high body count, and I mean, but he's completely self-interested, right? He obviously loves Russia, but at the end of the day, he loves Vlad most.
I well, I'm looking forward to the uh, the Putin biography.
Oh yeah, it'd be
we can
fascinating.
that would be terrific. But I hope we all survive to read it.
Yeah, you know the story of Petrov, this engineer in the Soviet bureaucracy. I forget the year, but it was at the height of the Cold War.
Yes.
Do you know?
Yes. Yeah. There was. Is he the fellow that refused to launch?
Yeah, he double checked, triple checked, and then quadruple checked
Right.
that there
He
was
didn't trust
a system error.
For whatever reason,
Yeah,
he thought
for whatever
that maybe
reason, and
the
that
Soviet computers could be wrong.
and that changed the
Yeah,
course of
and so-
history, and that that's an incredibly lucky outcome. And
Yeah,
like
no,
you've already
we're all-
seen, there's these false flag attacks in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
There's cyber attacks. All it takes is one little flare up for things to just get so out of hand, and that's that's crazy, right? I mean, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, was it the catalyst for World War One?
Right. Right.
it's
No, I mean,
unpredictable, the series of
these
events
are
that could.
all, these are the events that are basically governing our lives while we make plans.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Well, we record
go back to
podcasts.
planning. Right.
All right,
Okay, on
Jim.
to the next hurdle. Now that we've analyzed that to death.
Yes. No. Well.
Stay tuned. You know, I'm pessimistic by nature, but I think, I mean, in this situation, the opportunities, the gains from trade, as they say in economics, from a deal here, are enormous in theory. I mean, everybody could have, I mean, we should have had it by now. We could have reminded Putin that it takes 5 years for anybody to join NATO, and Ukraine is not on the top of the list.
Yeah, but he knows all this.
Of course, he knows all
He's
this.
an operator.
This is just an excuse.
Yeah,
That's why I'm
it's an
thinking that this
excuse.
is
It's an excuse.
just an excuse.
I thought initially
And,
it was just a very, very strong way to negotiate some sort of better
yeah,
situation for his gas into Europe. Simple as that, but it's clearly something bigger than that. Anyway, Jim,
yeah.
that was great. Thanks.
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. I did too. Thank you.
All right,
Thanks very
man.
much, Ron. All right.
So obviously, since this was recorded, the situation has changed quite dramatically. I'm recording this at 1 p.m. on Thursday, the 24th, Central European time. So Russia has invaded Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, has responded. Everyone is sort of unanimously against what Putin has done. Peter Hitchens just came out and called him raving stark mad. There is an unhinged element to all of this. It's very bizarre. But obviously, as things continue to unfold, we'll see what happens. I'm not going to make an appeal necessarily like I usually would do in other episodes to review and rate the podcast or anything like that. But I hope you got something out of this. I'm going to try and get as many previous guests on the podcast as possible who have a unique understanding or perspective of either Russia or Ukraine on the podcast to have them say something, what their 2 cents is of all of this. So for more in this speciality of looking into the world of kleptocracy, offshore finance, etc., you can look at episode 49 with Jim Henry, where we talk for about 3 hours about blood bankers. Bradley Hope, episode 51, who was the co-author of one of the biggest financial scandals in modern history, the 1MDB, and Joe Lowe. Episode 50, Pandora Papers, explained by Nick Shaxson, who alongside Jim is one of the godfathers of this field. And then an upcoming episode with Oliver Bullough, who wrote Moneyland, and then more and more as well. So this type of expertise is super relevant at the moment with Russia, Ukraine, given that most of the value, the production created in Russia is actually very, very, very unequally distributed to the top 100 oligarchs and kleptocrats whose money exists outside of Russia. And basically the whole point from Jim here that it could be used as a very strong stick of sanctions. That's all. Cheers.